He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Savior, he can move the mountain. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. And shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King.
One second.
I need you to soften my heart and break me apart. I need you to open my eyes and see that you're shaping my life. All I am, I surrender. Give me faith to trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. I need you to soften my heart, to break me apart. I need you to pierce through the dark and cleanse every part of me. All I am, I surrender.
All right. Okay, cool. So we're going to start. Yeah, okay. All right, so probably most of you know that I am a licensed clinical social worker. So I am a therapist at a local group practice here, and I work with people that have a lot of complex trauma, anxiety, depression, eating disorders. And the reason I thought it would be a good idea to have like a mental health weekend is because I feel like we are experiencing such a huge mental health crisis, especially after COVID. And I feel like this is part of just kind of like the conflict of that we're dealing with the end of time. Like our society is built around now dysregulation of like our nervous system, just from constant bombardments of like the news, of like social media, like 24/7. We're just hit with like fear-based propaganda, basically. And these are ways that I think Satan is waging war on our minds, and I think it's more important now than ever to be able to take care of our mental and physical health. And so that's what I wanted to focus on over this weekend. Tonight we're going to touch base on trauma, which I think a lot of our mental health actually stems from, and what that looks like, how it impacts our brain. And then tomorrow morning we'll build on that as to, okay, what is choosing love over fear, which is my topic of this weekend. What does that actually look like in practice? And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll go into the opposite of that in abuse. And what is that? How can we recognize the signs of that, in the world and our church, and how can we be able to stand against that, as well as what role does that play as we come to the end of times and the conflict for our minds? So, all right, without further ado, I'll say a quick prayer and then we can get started. All right, dear God, thank you for bringing us all here tonight. Please be with us and open our minds and be able to learn something new. Please be able to speak through me, and please let my words be your words. In Jesus' name, amen. So bear with me because I am not a public speaker, so I might be a little awkward or anxious or not know how technology works up here, but I'm going to do my best. Did it change? Like I said, okay, we got it. So first of all, just a little disclosure that some of these topics are going to be triggering, especially if you've been through your own like recent trauma. So I just want to make sure that everyone takes care of themselves. Like if you need to take a break, if you need to step out, we are recording this, so you can come back and watch this like in chunks if you need to. And that I've kind of labeled this like PG-13, so we do have a kids program going on, and for those watching at home, like it may be best if those who are younger ages don't watch, or you watch first and then decide if it's appropriate for them or not. So first, starting with the basics of what is trauma, because I think when people hear trauma, they're like, oh, that's when you go like overseas, like in combat, or like domestic violence or a natural disaster. And while those can be traumatic, like trauma is not necessarily about the event, but it's about how our like nervous systems and our bodies perceive something. So when something is life-threatening or feels overwhelming to us, then that's really what trauma is. Like I said, it's less about the event itself and more about how you're going to perceive the event. If anything feels like it's too much for us, then our bodies are going to go into like survival mode. And this can be things like I mentioned before, like like a natural disaster or combat, but it can also be things like the death of a loved one, like physical or emotional neglect, bullying, maybe experiences of shame or losing friendships. Any of these things can be traumatic if we don't know how to like process them fully. And who experiences trauma is this can be something that can happen to you directly. It can be something that maybe you've witnessed. It can be something you've learned about, like that someone may have witnessed, especially if it's someone that you care about or love. Maybe it's something that people are exposed to or hear about on a regular basis, such as like first responders or crisis workers or like pastors that have to hear a lot of really tough things day in and day out. And also what we're seeing like in social media. I mean, you go on the app every day and there's something traumatic there. So I think more and more like people are just bombarded with bad things that overwhelm their systems. And there's also research coming out regarding intergenerational trauma, which is passed down through families when like trauma isn't untreated. So this can be through like mental or physical health conditions, through like different beliefs, behaviors, like genetics, different things like that. And this is something that God warned us about like a long time ago during Moses' time. just like in Numbers where it says, "The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgressions, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation." And so I see this less of not, God not punishing us, but on letting us know that trauma is going to impact us, and not just us, but, our loved ones if we don't take the steps to, take care of ourselves. Like, he let us know that way back. And this is just a little number of, the statistics of what is going on kind of in the world and in our country today. So, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men experience sexual abuse in their lifetimes. And 1 billion children worldwide, or half of the world's children, are experiencing violence. And there's a study called Adverse Childhood Experiences, and some of you may have heard of it. And this followed a group of individuals from their childhood to their adulthood, and to see how their health would do. And so they looked at a number of factors, but broke things down into 10 what they called adverse childhood experiences or stressors. And they found out that the more adverse childhood experiences someone had, the more mental and physical health conditions that they would have later in life. And so here, in America, 61% of adults have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 6 adults have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And also, I just want to say that most likely we've all experienced some type of trauma. This isn't an us and them thing. This is a we thing. We are constantly, we're in a world full of sin, so there's not really a way to get around it. And experiencing and living with trauma does not mean that there's anything wrong with us or that we are necessarily to blame. Like I said, just the fact that there's sin in this world can lead to trauma and suffering. And there's a quote by Diane Lamberg in a book called Suffering in the Heart of God that says that you can do right and still have everything turn out wrong. I am not certain where we got the idea that was not so, given that the one we follow and call God did do everything right and ended up treated with gross injustice. And so how does God view and respond to trauma? Just looking through the Bible, there's so much trauma, just starting from there's times as slaves in Egypt, there's warfare, there's sexual assault, there's rape, there's loss and death. There's so much just all throughout, just the Old Testament. And what we see is God didn't just abandon his people and was peace out, you're on your own, you got to figure it out. He was always there, even before he sent his son to be on this earth. He was there in his presence, in the cloud, the pillar of fire, in the sanctuary, in the temple. He was always there and did not leave them just to suffer alone. And then even in the New Testament, where went so far as Jesus coming to this earth and undergoing trauma with his betrayal and crucifixion and everything that he faced here. He knows the trauma that we've been going through in a really special way. And I think that he continues to be among the trauma that we face, and we can go to him with whatever that we're facing because of what he went through here on this earth. And these are just some verses that I find really helpful and supportive for, my struggles and for the struggles that I see people around me going through. Just knowing that the Lord is near to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desire of those who fear him. He also hears their cry and saves them. For the mountains may depart and the hills be removed, but my steadfast love shall not depart from you. And my covenant of peace shall not be removed, says the Lord who has compassion on you. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. And I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So just take a look at, how does trauma really impact us? How does it impact our brains, and how does it impact our body? So after we experience a traumatic, event or traumatic situation, the makeup of our brain literally starts to change. We begin to have heightened cortisol, which is the stress hormone. Those levels start to go higher, and serotonin levels, which regulates our mood, it regulates sleep, our ability to learn. Those levels are going to go lower, which tends to lead to more greater incidences of like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And trauma also often isn't integrated in the brain in the same way as like a less emotionally charged memories are. So this leads the brain to be more easily triggered into like to that like protective mode, which is like, the fight, flight, freeze. The window of tolerance is a concept developed by Dr. Dan Siegel, and it's a level of arousal at which you're able to process and tolerate emotions and take in new information and to basically feel like physically and emotionally safe. So when we've experienced trauma or like a traumatic situation, we respond with a mix of like what's called hyperarousal, which is like that being on guard, like really being heightened aware, being like in that panic, anxiety, like irritated mode, and then like hypoarousal, which is like the more depression, lethargic, dissociated state. Either of these states is called being outside that window of tolerance. And so when you're outside your window of tolerance, the brain's not going to take in any new information. You're going to respond basically like you're back in that situation that was traumatic in the first place. So when we are in danger, to keep us safe, our body's going to respond in either the fight, flight, freeze, or when we're in that hyperaroused state, or when all those fail, it goes into what's called the hypoaroused, or like the shutdown or submit. And so when our brain goes into these modes, like our prefrontal cortex, which is known as like our thinking brain right here, these shut off, because if we're like, say, running from a bear, we don't need to sit down and decide like, okay, what's the best way to get out of here? How am I gonna get out of here safe? Like, we just need to like move. We just need to get out of there. And so our bodies are automatically going to begin to respond in order to protect us in the best way that we know how. So some hyperarousal responses that are common is going to be like the fight, flight, freeze responses. And some people are like surprised with like, okay, why freeze here? But freeze is not necessarily that you're frozen, but you're also like ready and prepared for what's going to happen next. So you're still going to experience these similar responses in freeze. So this is like, being very tense, like racing heart, difficulty breathing. You're going to have like high blood pressure, racing thoughts, very hypersensitive to like the environment around you and any potential like danger cues. You're going to have a desire to like either fight, criticize or judge others, like run away or escape, look for help, or feeling unable to move but still on edge. And some really overwhelming emotions usually accompany that, such as like anxiety, anger, or panic. And then the other side of the window is the hypoarousal responses. So these are more of like submitting and shutting down. And these happen when like the more hyper-aroused responses fail or they're not expected to work. So these include things such as, slumped posture, like lower blood pressure. You feel really lethargic or numb, like some people feel dizzy and faint, nauseous. There's gonna be some like numbness of the emotions or numbness of your body, foggy thinking, like difficulty being able to think through clearly, disconnecting from your body or the environment, some like dissociation, and you experience a desire to like hide, withdraw, or like isolate from everyone. And they just have some overwhelming emotions such as like depression, hopelessness, shame, and despair. So our brains imprint a behavior that we engage in over and over. As a result, the pathway in our brains is going to become stronger while the other pathways are going to become weaker. So when we face a challenge or stressor, our brain's going to automatically use the strongest connection, whether it's going to be most effective in that situation or not. Especially if it's an actual dangerous situation or it's reminiscent of maybe past danger, even the smallest way, our thinking brains are going to shut off and our bodies are going to respond with what's kept us safe before. So the amygdala is the part of our brain that's the alarm for danger. It's a really small part in like the back of our brain and like the emotional part. And so the more trauma that we experience, the more sensitive that this amygdala is going to become. And so the more sensitive it becomes, the easier it's going to be to get set off. As a result, it may be possible to feel in danger constantly or at any point during your day if we have like an overactive amygdala. So for example, if like say someone went through like abuse with someone that always wore like a blue coat, they may be like walking down the street, somebody passes with a blue coat on, they may not even consciously think about it or recognize it, but their brains may be like, something's wrong, we're unsafe, we need to find safety now. And they may be thrown off for the rest of their day and may not even know exactly why. So in that triggered moment, they're gonna feel like they did in that original traumatic event happened. So they may be similar emotions, thoughts, and body sensations. The thing is that we may not even be aware that we are triggered or what triggered us. Because like I mentioned before, like trauma memories don't get stored the same way as less like emotionally charged memories. So like if you're thinking of, oh, my vacation, like, I really enjoyed that and all the things that I did there, the hotel, the beach, or whatever it was. Like we don't remember those like physical or certain aspects of it when it comes to trauma. What we do remember is more of like the bodily memories. So we're like, okay, I feel a certain way. I feel something in my body. I feel an emotion. This feels not good, but I don't know why. I think that's what makes it so hard with trauma, is because our bodies are like, okay, I don't feel safe. I need to get to safety, and I don't even know why necessarily I feel that way. So this is a video that kind of explains a little bit of what that looks like.
It's like living with a leash on a little bit. You can do some stuff, but every now and then you remember that it's there.
I was living in Japan during the earthquake in 2011.
A few weeks and months of political unrest while I was living overseas. We lived with bags by the door ready to go in case we needed to get out.
I found out in 2008 I had PTSD, complex PTSD, but I think the diagnosis should have probably been made when I was 14 years old.
I was raped, and as a result, I live with PTSD.
The civil war in Lebanon broke out in 1975. I was only 17 years old. I lived through that for about 12 years.
As it kind of sunk in, I started to feel really guilty because I had always associated PTSD with people who had been to war, and I just didn't think I deserved it.
The PTSD triggers, they ambush you. You don't know when it's gonna come. It's sort of the unknown. Every day you wake up and you don't know if you're going to have a trigger today.
I was at a movie, and there's a part where this woman got trapped in a car. I had a serious panic attack.
There was a song that was talking about like shooting and armed robbery, and just hearing that song, that was all it took.
Something happened when I was 13, and when my trigger happens, in that moment, I am 13.
Usually the sounds of jet planes overhead would trigger off the memory for me of those days. It would make me feel weak in the legs, and my memory will go back to that time trying to look after my children when they were little and protect them. Yeah, all I had to do is hear a jet plane, and that's where my mind will go.
At times, it has literally felt like I'm dying. You feel like you're never gonna get past this. One of the things that's helped me a lot was group therapy. This happens to more people than you think.
Start to have a conversation with this thing that you have.
I did counseling for 2 years in college, and it felt like that got my life into a pretty manageable place.
I am trying to build up the courage to attend a support group.
I would have these days where you're just like, there's nothing I can do to do anything that you're supposed to do. In group therapy, someone called it a lost day. It's such a simple thing, but putting the words lost day to those days helped me overcome.
And I think accepting that is really important, and just being like, it's okay to freak out and just be like, oh, this is scary, because it's scary.
And don't ever tell them to get over it, because it's extremely painful.
It takes practice, and it takes patience, and it takes faith. You have to know that the fact that you've been through something so traumatic and you're here, you are much stronger than you think you are.
Don't feel guilty when you have a good day.
Give yourself time to heal.
You can't judge yourself for it.
It'll never be the same, but it can get better, and it's worth whatever it's gonna take. You can have a better life.
There is a light at the end of the tunnel. You just got to find the right thing that works for you.
And getting help is not a sign of weakness. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage, and You deserve the happiness that comes with getting better.
My name is Kate.
My name is Tammy.
My name is Kirk, and I live with PTSD.
And you don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis of PTSD to relate to that, because I think a lot of us maybe go through something similar and can relate to some of what they said. So some other symptoms of trauma are, depression, shame and guilt, anxiety, panic attacks. They may have a lot of, nightmares or flashbacks, which is kind of remembering or just getting hit with memories or, similar physical sensations during the day. Low self-esteem or self-worth, difficulty concentrating, maybe troubles with sleep, whether it's insomnia or then sleeping too much, changes in appetite, whether it's loss of appetite or overeating, maybe have difficulty trusting others or maybe trusting too easily, and then also physical illnesses or diagnoses, because with the stress, hormones or the stress chemicals, they're not only impacting our brains, but they're now impacting our bodies. So they're going to impact, our immune systems as well. So people that undergo, a lot of trauma also tend to have a lot of physical illnesses and physical health issues. So there are a lot of different ways that people try to then cope with their trauma symptoms. Some of them are healthy and some of them are not so healthy. And these are usually what people tend to come into seeking help for. So they tend to be, chemical or behavioral addictions, and this can be, drugs or alcohol or, sugar or eating, or things like, relationships or work or exercise, anything that people feel like they can't live without, or some of these symptoms are gonna come back. This can also be codependency, people-pleasing, eating disorders. You see like self-harm or suicidal behaviors. Also participating in criminal behavior or abusive behavior toward others. There's, I think, a research study that's done that shows that a huge percentage of people that are in prisons and jails have very high adverse childhood experiences scores. So there's a lot of trauma that usually comes from, people that have trauma tend to also perpetrate trauma onto others. Intellectualizing, which is instead of feeling your emotions and trying to use that as understanding and healing and growing, to automatically go to logic, to try to make sense of things, to try to fix things, and bypassing a very important part of ourselves. As well as spiritual bypassing, which is, I wanted to emphasize a little bit because that's similar to intellectualizing, but instead of using logic, it's going to immediately to, I'm going to use my religious or spiritual practices and push my emotions aside. So while those are really great things, and I think they can help us heal, we also need to use them with feeling our emotions and with recognizing where we're at. Because if we just, are like, well, I went through something terrible, but, God always provides and there's always a reason, we're kind of in denial of where we're at, and we're kind of shutting God out of our lives in that way, to be like, sometimes I'm struggling with feeling really down, sometimes I'm struggling with anger, and God wants to know that, God needs to know that, and that's how we're going to move forward with healing. So now that we know how our brains are impacted by all of that, what are ways that we can start to heal our nervous systems? So luckily our brains are what's called plastic. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to adapt and change. Just like the brain adapts and grows connections in response to trauma, it can also change as we begin to choose different responses, behaviors, and beliefs as we start to heal. It takes a lot of conscious effort and practice, but we are able to change our brains. And these are just different ways that kind of help in changing the brain. There are what's called top-down methods, and this is really just being able to connect with others and have relationships with others, because I do believe that we heal through relationships. And so this is kind of like the talk therapy, the support groups, the having a good community around you, being able to feel validated and understood with what you've went through. There's also taking medication, which I do think medication has its time and place and purpose, because sometimes our chemicals in our brain are so out of whack from so much trauma that this can kind of help with shutting down the inappropriate alarm reactions and help you kind of stay level so you can start moving through more treatment and get the help that you need. And there's also what's called bottom-up methods. So this is more of like the body practices and, taking care of yourself physically, and being able to utilize, movement, breathing, taking care of our bodies, all of that combines together to be able to change our brains. So there's just some tools or some skills that we can all implement in our lives and our church that can help with regulating our nervous systems. So empathy is a very important one for basic mental health. So that's connecting with people so we know that we're not alone when we're in struggle. It's a way to connect to the emotion another person is experiencing, and it doesn't require that we have experienced the same situation that we're going through. So we may not have, been through the same exact thing someone may experience. We may be like, I felt sadness, so I know what it's like to feel sad, and I can sit with somebody in this sadness. And the Bible, I think, has a lot of verses that do support that. Of Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. And 1 Corinthians 12:26, if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. Or if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. And just some examples of empathy in the Bible, clear for me is Jesus weeping when Lazarus had passed away and was able to be there with all the other people who had lost him. And Jesus being able to come down and meet people where they're at and sit with them in their emotions and in their pain. He experienced both, pain and their joy and happiness. And while he did provide with their needs, he also was able to just see them for where they're at and didn't condemn them, and was able to kind of meet them where they needed to turn their life around, such as with Mary Magdalene. Boundaries is also a very important skill, and it's such a tough one, I think, in our society. I will say this is the most common talked about thing in my sessions with my clients, and the most difficult thing for them to put into practice. So boundaries are defined as something that indicates a border or a limit. So in a healthy state, this limit is flexible and changeable, responding moment by moment to both inner and outer conditions. So when someone experiences trauma, there aren't any boundaries. No one's sitting there being like, oh, let me know when this is too much. It's all bombarding you. It's all overwhelming. So some people may never be able to say no to anything, and they're going to have very loose boundaries, if any at all. Or on the other side, we may have very extremely rigid boundaries and may not let anyone or anything into our lives. So therefore, part of healing from trauma is to be able to start to form those healthy boundaries. So there's a lot of examples I feel like in the Bible that show the importance of boundaries, like just Jesus taking time away from the crowds and the people to be by himself, and just taking time with his Father, and then returning to teaching afterwards. And also leaving towns where he felt like he was no longer welcomed or accepted, and showing respect for those people's boundaries and their choices. Like in Matthew 10:14, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust from your feet. I think healthy boundaries are a give and take, and a balance, of time alone, of time together, of time and love given and received, and of respecting others' time and space, and of others respecting ours. And they are flexible and able to change as needed. It's not just that you set a boundary and that's it forever. You're able to, move through life and decide what's an appropriate boundary for me in this relationship at this time. So boundaries are not forcing someone to see things our way, or trying to control someone, or continuing to push matters after someone says stop or says no. Even if someone is going down an unhealthy path, that is their choice, because God has given us that freedom of choice. So just some ways that boundary setting looks like in practice. Just for basic physical is looks like asking before touching. So this is important for people who have been through sexual assault or physical assault, being approached or being touched physically before having that consent can be very triggering. And I know in the South we're more of hugging people, but it's just something to always keep in mind, especially when meeting somebody new, to be aware of. Just asking hey, is it okay if I give you a hug or whatever, instead of just assuming sometimes. being able to say yes or no to things without shame or guilt, and respecting when someone says yes or no to things without pressuring or guilting. Not taking responsibility for others' emotions while still being respectful of how others feel. And that's kind of more what I call like internal boundaries, knowing when it's your emotion versus somebody else's and not trying to step in and take that emotion from them. I think it's hard sometimes to sit there and watch someone go through pain and not want to fix it or not want to take care of them, but to know that if they haven't asked for something, like it's okay to just sit there and be like, hey, I'm here with you. Practice that empathy in this sadness. Like, let me know what you need instead of just jumping in and trying to take that emotion on as our own. Also kind of goes along with not fixing a problem for someone else that they are capable of fixing themselves. So I think it's important to ask if someone wants, support before just giving it, but also recognizing when maybe it's a problem that they are more than capable of fixing, and it may benefit them in the long run if they're able to do so, and to be able to say no if we recognize that, as well as if we don't have the capacity to do so. Like, it's okay to be like, I just don't have the emotional, depth or tolerance today, or I just don't have the time or the space to do this. Like, it is okay to say no and to trust that they will find somebody else who does. And sticking to time frames that have been set. So starting and ending at the, time that you may have said. So this is, I think, a really good video that kind of shows the importance of boundaries and how they all kind of tie together with, empathy, compassion, and love.
One of the most shocking findings of my work was the idea that the most compassionate people I have interviewed over the last 13 years were also the absolutely most boundaried. Because
most boundaried.
So I'll give you a great definition of the definition of boundary that I use in the book. Boundary is simply what's okay and what's not okay. What I think we do is we don't set boundaries. We let people do things that are not okay or get away with behaviors that are not okay. Then we're just resentful and hateful. Me, I'd rather be loving and generous and very straightforward with what's okay and what's not okay. And I did not, that I learned from the research. I was the exact opposite. I assumed for the first 35 years of my life that people were sucking on purpose just to piss me off. Mm-hmm. That's what I assumed. Whether it was someone who worked for me or it was someone family member who was constantly I was always critical and judgy. And I was like, why are they choosing these things? Why are they making their choices? They should know better. And then when this thing came up from my therapist, what if people are doing the best they can? I thought, my husband had the most beautiful answer to that question. He said, I'll never know whether people are doing the best they can or not. But when I assume people are, it makes my life better. So now I think I am not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm far more loving.
It's not just some technique so that you can do that. That's really a way of being to nurture that soil of wholeheartedness.
Yeah. Generosity, to assume the best about people, is almost an inherently selfish act, because the life you change first is your own.
You love yourself.
Yeah. And so my question is big, B-I-G. Mm-hmm. What boundaries need to be in place for me to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumptions about you? But generosity can't exist without boundaries, and we are not comfortable setting boundaries because we care more about what people will think, and we don't want to disappoint anyone. We want everyone to like us, and boundaries are not easy. But I think they're the key to self-love, and I think they're the key to treating others with loving kindness. Sustaining. Nothing is sustainable without boundaries. I think compassion and empathy are different things. And again, I'm relying on my data for this. I think compassion is a deeply held belief that we're inextricably connected to each other by something rooted in love and goodness. I call that God. Not everybody calls that God. My dad would call it fishing.
Fishing?
Fishing?
Is it fishing?
No, there's no G in fishing.
Okay.
But I think compassion is a deeply held belief. I think empathy is the skill set to bring compassion alive. So empathy is something we can teach. I mean, it's something we've taught our kids since they were very little. It's about how to communicate that deep love for people in a way so that people don't know they're not alone. I think there's a lot of new interesting information out there about empathy not being a good thing, about that, there's an argument that says, if Travis is in struggle and I practice empathy with you, I'm taking on your darkness, and it leads to burnout, and it leads to, but empathy is not feeling for somebody. It's feeling with them. It's touching a place in me that knows where you've been, so I can look at you and say, me too, brother. You're not alone in this. And I find empathy to be infinite. I think it gives back tenfold what you put out.
It's sustaining. Like if you've done the work and you have your boundaries, I mean, you could tread that water forever and never get tired.
Okay, so empathy. I'm quoting Travis here. Empathy. If you've done your work and set your boundaries, you can tread that water forever. Yeah. Amen. It's not finite. And it keeps giving back to us. And so this idea that, but here we go back to where we started this conversation. Empathy minus boundaries is not empathy. Compassion minus boundaries is not genuine. Vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. So you see that there's a huge riff here, which is boundaries are freaking important.
Right.
And they're not fake walls. They're not separation. Boundaries are not division. They're respect. Here's what's okay for me and here's what's not.
And Ty Gibson says something about how empathy without boundaries is self-abuse. And I do find that to be true. Because if we aren't able to check with ourselves and be like, okay, where do my boundaries lie? Then we continue to give and give, but it's usually from a place that is unhealed. It's usually a place of, because I want to make sure that, you like me, or because I want to make sure you don't ever have to feel the way that I felt before. There's usually something deeper behind that. So once we're able to figure out where our boundaries are, I think it opens up a whole new level of healing and a whole new level of empathy and compassion that we can have for people. Like, boundaries and empathy, they have to go hand in hand, honestly, for me. But anyways, so next thing is that I want to discuss is mindfulness. So mindfulness is not meditation, which I think sometimes people automatically go to. Mindfulness is defined as paying attention in a particular way on purpose to the present moment and non-judgmentally. So mindfulness is known to keep the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking brain, online, so you're less likely to get triggered to the point of going out of your window of tolerance and into that hyper or hypoarousal mode. So this for me is being able to be here right now and to be in the present instead of, worrying about what's the future, what are we going to do tomorrow, what are we going to eat, what are we going to wear, what are we going to, all of that things, or obsessing about the past and kind of beating yourself up for, I can't believe I said that in 7th grade, or whatever it might be. And just like that, the verse in Matthew that says, so do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has worries of its own. So it's really just being here and trying to make the most of what can I do today with what God has given me. So some simple ways to practice mindfulness, especially if it's something that we may struggle with, is when you find your mind going somewhere else and be like, I'm really struggling to be here, or I'm really struggling to not be, judging or beating myself up, is kind of focusing on your breathing or focusing, back to your body of bring yourself back to the present, focusing on your senses, which people do a lot, when they're having panic attacks of okay, what are things I can see, hear, touch, maybe some mindful movements, like going for a walk, just to be able to connect back to your body. doing some basic grounding, so, sensing your legs or feet on the ground. Some people are very much into like a movement of, walking bare feet on the ground just to feel more connected to the earth, and being a mindful observer of what we are feeling and thinking instead of letting our emotions and thoughts run the show. I think being able to just take that pause and take that step back and identify, okay, what emotion am I feeling, and what story am I telling myself because of that, kind of gives us that space to be able to then respond instead of automatically react to whatever we may be feeling in that moment. So this was a little bit mentioned in the video I showed, but compassion, which compassion is defined as noticing and feeling moved by someone's experience of pain and the desire to alleviate their suffering. And this is seen, I think, so much in Jesus and his example when he was here on earth, and is given to us as well today, is therefore as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So compassion can be shown to others as well as to yourself. And I think that's something that we tend to forget. And also another concept that I go through a lot with my clients is that self-compassion, because we tend to beat ourselves up a lot, and that not only impacts us, but it impacts our relationship with other people, because then we assume that everybody else is seeing us that way, and then we tend to believe the worst of others because we think they're believing the worst of us. And just how it's written in the Bible of you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Like, we are also important in that. And there's so much research behind, compassion and self-compassion that shows that it's been linked to better mental and physical health and greater well-being, and just that people tend to be less critical of themselves, and well as, less likely to be anxious and depressed, and report greater life satisfaction when they're able to have more of that compassion towards others and towards themselves. And just basic practices that I tend to, start people with, and do myself when I find myself beating myself up for self-compassion, is just first noticing it, and then taking a pause, and sometimes repeating to yourself, this is just one moment of suffering. It's not going to last forever, and may I be kind to myself right now. Or imagining that this was someone maybe that you loved going through something similar, or saying something similar to themselves, and what would you say to them? And trying to also rephrase that and say the same thing to yourself, because you're just as deserving as that compassion as they are. Or imagining what God would say to you in this difficult moment, because God's presence and love is always with you. And he sent his son to die for us, and so his love is infinite, and he wants that same love for us. And self-soothing is kind of a basic way of okay, I'm feeling very overwhelmed or very triggered in this moment. That kind of helps bring the emotion down to that window of tolerance that we talked about. So we're okay, now I can be able to, feel a little bit better and maybe figure out what I'm feeling and kind of go from there. So these are more of engages the senses, having a warm drink, lighting candles, music, hand over heart, different ways to just engage those senses that help make things a little bit more tolerable in the moment. And just overall, being kind and loving, which I think each of those practices and concepts we talked about is part of that bigger picture of being loving. Research shows that love stimulates the frontal lobes, or the prefrontal cortex, which is that thinking brain, which regulates the amygdala, or the alarm for trauma. So the more that love and compassion that we are able to focus on, the less fear that we're going to feel. So those who have experienced trauma and fear so often feel unlovable, and that's the really greatest lie of all. So what we need the most, especially following trauma, is love. And I think that research just goes perfect with what God told us in 1 John 4:18 of there is no fear in love, because perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. So what does this have to do with the end of times? Is kind of like I said, I feel like we're living this right now. The condition of humankind is getting worse. We're having more, famines, wars, earthquakes, so much hate and division. This is all leading to more and more suffering and trauma and more mental health problems. And so Matthew 24:14 encourages us to share the gospel and the truth about God. And the truth about God is that he is love and he's compassion personified, which I think is shown throughout the Gospels and throughout the entire Bible. So if we're able to show that love and compassion to others, especially during these traumatic times, I think that's how we can witness about God and his character and help people to see that, hey, we have something different. Like, not only are we taking care of ourselves and our mental health, but maybe we can be a light to the world to say, like, with all this hate, with all this suffering, with all this trauma, there's something that we have that's different. There's a love that maybe we have that nobody else is showing. So I wanted to end with a couple quotes. This is from Diane Lamberg's book, Suffering in the Heart of God. And she says that we are not okay on this groaning planet, and I believe wholeheartedly that the body of Jesus Christ is called to step into the mess and bring light and life. He has not called us to live cloistered lives away from the mess. And frankly, given the stats, we cannot. If 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 men in our pews have been sexually abused, 1 in 3 experience domestic violence, 1 in 5 have been raped, our children are being bullied, our streets are not safe, and our families are losing loved ones to war, suicide, and disease. All these things exist among the people of God, just as they exist in the world at large. And Ellen White writes in Prophets and Kings that beyond our knowledge or control, our influence affects others in blessing or cursing. It may be heavy with a gloom of discontent and selfishness, or it may be charged with the life-giving power of faith, courage, hope, and sweet with the fragrance of love. But potent for good or evil it will be. It's up to us to decide which one that's going to be. All right, and that is the end of part 1. So I hope you guys come back to part 2 because we're going to build on that some more. But, thank you. I will end with closing prayer, and then I think there's some refreshments in the back. Yes. All right, awesome. Oh, and I'm here for questions afterwards because I know there was a lot of information. So if you have any questions, just let me know. And also Patty, who also works with mental health too, either of us. So, all right. Dear God, thank you so much for bringing us here tonight and for helping me be able to say what I needed. Please help us to continue to learn what you want us to through this weekend and to get us home safely. And thank you for your Sabbath day and for the love that you continue to show to us and to heal our minds. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Come easy.